He came up the road on foot with 2 children and a bundle wrapped around a fever, and the sky doing what a January sky in that country did when it had made up its mind. Joseph Huvison, 38 years old. The bank had taken the farm on a Monday, and by Wednesday he was walking, which was the shape a man's life sometimes found when the paper was signed by other men in another county. He carried the girl. Her name was Emma. 7 years old and light as a bundle of kindling, which was the fever, and the fever had been climbing since morning. His son walked at his side. Samuel, 9, wearing his father's silence like a coat he had grown into early. They had passed 3 houses and knocked at 2. The first had answered and closed the door before Joseph had finished the sentence. The second had not answered at all, though the smoke was going and the lamp was lit and the curtain moved once at the window. He had walked on without saying anything about it to his son. Some things a boy of 9 did not need spelled out to understand. The Bell place sat at the top of the rise where the road took a slow bend around a stand of black cottonwoods and let the land fall away toward the river bottom. It was a plain house, square and honest, with a stone chimney taking the smoke straight up in a thin white line, and a barn behind it big enough for real work, and a windmill that was not turning the way a windmill ought to turn. The gate was closed. The gate had been closed for a long time. There was a look to a gate that had been closed on purpose year after year, and this one had it. Cuthbertson Bell was the widow up there. That was what the country called her, though widow only accounted for part of it. 41. Her husband gone 6 years and her son gone with him in the same week of the same fever, and a daughter carried off 2 winters after that in a way the town did not care to name aloud. Since then she had done her business at the store on Thursday mornings when the aisles were empty, and she had spoken to no one who did not require speaking to, and the door of her house had been closed to callers so long that people had stopped remembering when it had last been open. Cold, the town said. A woman turned cold. They said it the way people say a thing to save themselves the trouble of knowing better. Joseph did not know any of this. He knew only that the girl in his arms was burning and that the sky was going the color a sky went when it meant snow inside the hour. He came up the walk with Samuel a step behind him and stopped at the door and shifted the girl to free his knocking hand. He knocked once. He waited. He knocked again. The door opened enough for a face and not more. Cuthbertson Bell was tall, taller than most women he had met, and her hair was pulled back the way a woman pulls it back when she is not entertaining opinions on it, and her eyes went first to the child and did not linger there and came back to him. She said nothing. She waited for him to speak. It was not unkind exactly. It was the waiting of a person who had learned that the first thing a stranger says at a door is almost never the thing they mean. He wet his lip. He had rehearsed nothing. There had been no time for it. "Ma'am," he said, "let my daughter sleep in your barn, just the barn, just till the fever breaks." She looked at him a long moment. She looked at the boy behind him, standing with his hands at his sides in the way of a child who had been taught not to ask for anything. She looked at the bundle in his arms and the flush on the girl's cheek, and the way the girl's head lay against his shoulder without lifting. The wind came up the rise and moved the corner of her apron, and she did not seem to notice it. Behind her the house was warm. He could feel the warm coming past her in the crack of the open door, and he was aware of it the way a man in the cold is aware of everything he is not. "No," she said. The word landed clean and did not apologize for itself. Joseph took it the way he had taken the 2 doors before, with a nod he did not quite complete, and he was already turning, already shifting the girl to start the walk back down the rise when she said it. "Barns are for animals." He stopped. He was not sure he had heard it right. He looked back at her over his shoulder, and she had already opened the door the rest of the way, and she was standing to the side of it with her hand still on the knob and her face doing nothing at all that could be read as welcome. But the door was open. The warm was coming out. She was waiting. "Bring her in," she said, "before the wind takes what's left of her." He came up the step. Samuel came behind him. The door closed behind them, and the wind was gone, and the room was very still and very warm and smelled of wood smoke, and something with onions in it that had been on the stove a while. There was a rag rug in front of the hearth. There was a rocker beside it with a folded shawl over the back. There was a table with two chairs and the second chair pushed in flush the way a chair gets pushed in when nobody has pulled it out in a long time. "Put her there," Cuthbertson said, and she pointed at the sofa under the front window. "The wool blanket on the trunk. Fold it double under her." He did what she said. He laid Emma down and folded the blanket and slid it beneath her, and the girl made a small sound that was not quite waking and turned her face toward the back of the sofa. Cuthbertson was already at the stove. She was already lifting the lid of the kettle and setting it back and moving to the shelf above the dry sink where a row of small glass jars sat lined up like soldiers on parade. "How long has she been like this?" Cuthbertson said, without turning. "Since before light. Started coughing yesterday. By noon today she couldn't walk. Has she taken water?" "Some, not enough." The boy, Joseph, looked at Samuel. Samuel had not moved from the door. He was standing on the mat with his cap in both hands, looking at the floor, doing what he had been taught to do in a house that was not his. "He's well," Joseph said. "He's tired." "Sit down," Cuthbertson said to the boy without looking at him. "The chair by the fire. Take your boots off first and set them on the stone so they'll dry." Samuel looked at his father. Joseph nodded once. The boy bent and worked at his laces with fingers that had gone red at the knuckles and did not want to obey him. And Cuthbertson came across the room with a tin cup in her hand and steam coming off it. And she knelt beside the sofa without seeming to notice that she was kneeling. She got an arm under Emma's shoulders and lifted her enough to bring the cup to her mouth. She did it the way a woman does a thing she has done 1,000 times and stopped doing and has not forgotten. Her hand at the back of the child's neck was steady. Her voice, when it came, was pitched low and even, the way you speak to a horse that is thinking about bolting. "Small sips," she said. "That's the way. Small sips. Don't fight it." Emma took the cup against her lip and swallowed once and coughed and swallowed again. Whatever was in the cup was pale and steaming and smelled of something bitter under the honey. Cuthbertson watched the girl's throat work and lowered her back to the blanket and set the cup on the floor beside the sofa within reach. "Willow bark," she said to Joseph without looking up, "and a little honey to make it drinkable, every hour till the fever turns. If she keeps it down, we'll try broth by dark." "Yes, ma'am. And take that coat off. You're bringing the cold in with you every time you move." He took the coat off. He hung it on the peg by the door where she pointed. He stood in the middle of her front room in his shirt sleeves with his hands empty, and did not know what to do with them, which was a thing that had been happening to him for 3 days, and he had not gotten used to it. Cuthbertson went back to the stove. She did not tell him to sit, and she did not tell him to stand, and he understood from the way she moved that she was not going to tell him. He was going to have to work out for himself what a man does in a house he has walked into with nothing. He crossed to Samuel and knelt and helped the boy with the second boot and set them together on the hearthstone with the toes pointing at the fire. Samuel would not look at him. The boy had been holding himself up since Monday morning, and the warm room was doing to him what warm rooms do to children who have been holding themselves up, and Joseph could see him starting to come apart at the edges and could see him fighting it. "Sit," Joseph said. "Like the lady said. I'm here." The boy sat. He put his hands flat on his knees and he stared into the fire, and his shoulders came down 1/2 inch and stayed there. Cuthbertson came past them with a folded quilt from the chest at the foot of the stairs and laid it over Emma without a word. Then she went to the window and looked out at the sky and the line of the ridge and the way the light was going, and she said, "It'll snow by dark, heavy. You won't be walking anywhere tonight." "Ma'am," Joseph said, "I don't mean to impose." She turned from the window and looked at him. It was a plain look, and there was nothing warm in it, but there was nothing cruel in it either. It was the look of a woman making an accounting of a situation and not entertaining sentiment about any part of it. "You've imposed already," she said. "The imposing is done. What's left is the practical part." She nodded at the sofa. "The child sleeps there tonight. The boy takes the bed in the back room. It's made up. You take the loft. There's a straw tick and 2 blankets, and it's warmer than it looks. The stove will hold till morning if you feed it at midnight. Can you feed a stove?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then feed it. I'll not have that child taking a chill on top of what she's already carrying." "Yes, ma'am." "Stop saying ma'am, it's Cuthbertson." He did not answer her because he did not know what to answer, and she did not seem to require an answer. She went back to the stove and lifted the lid on a pot that had been sitting to the side and moved it over the heat and stirred it once and put the lid back. The smell of onions came up stronger, and there was meat in it somewhere and something like a potato broken down into softness. She did not ask if they were hungry. She was not going to ask. She was going to feed them, and that was the end of it. Joseph sat down at the table because standing had begun to feel like a failure of some kind. He put his hands flat on the wood and he looked at them, and he did not look at the woman working at the stove because looking at her felt like taking more than he had already taken. Outside the window, the light had gone gray at the edges and the first flakes were beginning. Not many yet, just the scouts of what was coming, drifting past the glass without any hurry about them. Samuel had begun to nod at the fire. His chin came down to his chest and jerked back up and came down again. Cuthbertson glanced at him once and said nothing and went to the back room and came out with a folded shirt of some kind, plain flannel, worn soft, and she laid it on the arm of the rocker and said to Joseph without turning, "When he goes down, put that on him. His own is damp through. He'll take fever too if he sleeps in it." "Whose is it?" Joseph said before he had thought about whether to ask. She stopped at the stove with her back to him. She did not turn around. She said, "It's clean. That's all that matters," and she lifted the lid on the pot again and stirred it, and Joseph understood that he had asked a question he was not going to be answered on, and he understood also that the shirt had belonged to a boy about Samuel's size, and he did not ask again. She served the stew in 3 bowls at the table, and she woke Samuel with a hand on his shoulder and brought him over and sat him down without ceremony. The boy ate the way a hungry child eats when he has been told all his life not to eat that way, in small, careful spoonfuls that got less careful as he went. Cuthbertson ate standing at the stove, one hand on the counter, the bowl in the other, watching the window. She ate half of what was in her bowl and set it aside and poured the rest into Samuel's when he had finished his without asking him if he wanted it. Emma stirred on the sofa and made a small sound. Cuthbertson was there before Joseph had finished pushing back his chair. She got the cup and lifted the girl and got another swallow into her, and the girl's eyes came open partway and looked at the woman above her without focusing and drifted closed again. "She's a little cooler," Cuthbertson said. "Not much, but a little." "Thank you," Joseph said. He had said it already at the door, and it had not been enough then, and it was not enough now, but it was the only word he had. She looked at him across the room. The lamp was between them, and the light of it did something to her face that took 10 years off her for the length of a breath and put them back on. She said, "Don't thank me yet. The night's the long part." Then she turned down the lamp. The night was the long part. The fever climbed toward midnight the way fevers do, and Cuthbertson sat in the rocker beside the sofa with a cloth in a basin of cold water on the floor beside her, and she did not sleep. Joseph came down from the loft at midnight and fed the stove and stood a while at the foot of the sofa, and Cuthbertson did not look up at him, but she said, "She'll break by morning or she won't. Go back up. There's nothing for you to do down here that I'm not already doing." He went back up. He lay on the straw tick in the dark under the roof and listened to the wind coming up around the house, and he thought about the 2 closed doors before this one, and he thought about the word the woman below him had said first and the word she had said second, and he did not sleep either. By dawn the fever had turned. Emma was cool to the touch and her breathing had gone deep, and she slept the sleep of a child whose body had decided to live. Cuthbertson was still in the rocker. She had not moved for hours. When Joseph came down the ladder, she looked up at him, and her eyes were red-rimmed with the tiredness of a long watch, and she said, "She'll want soup when she wakes. Thin. Not the stew. There's a broth in the crock on the shelf." Then she got up and walked to the back of the house and closed the door of her own bedroom behind her, and Joseph heard the bed take her weight, and then he heard nothing. He looked out the front window. The world was white. It had snowed all night without stopping, and it was still snowing, and the fence posts along the road were down to their tops, and the road itself was gone. Not just under snow. Gone. Erased. There was no road anymore. There was a field of unbroken white where a road had been the day before, and beyond it more of the same, and beyond that the sky coming down to meet it in one continuous color that could not be told from the ground. They were not walking anywhere. Not that day. Not for many days. Emma woke Mudmanung and took the broth and asked for her father in a voice that was hers again, and Joseph sat on the floor beside the sofa and held her hand and did not trust himself to speak for a while. Samuel came out of the back room in the flannel shirt that was too big for him at the shoulders, and he stood in the doorway looking at his sister, and something came out of him that had been held in since the bank, and he crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside his father without a word, and Joseph put his other arm around the boy, and the three of them stayed that way a long time. Cuthbertson slept until noon. When she came out, she looked at the three of them on the floor, and she looked at the window and the snow still coming down, and she said, "You'll be here through the thaw, that's the reality of it. There's no getting out and no getting to you, so we'd best come to an understanding." Joseph got up off the floor. "Name it," he said. "The windmill's not turning," she said. "Hasn't for 2 years. The pen's fences are down in 3 places. The porch rails rotted through on the east side. The barn roof lost shingles in the fall wind and I never got to it. There's a winter's worth of work here I've been letting slide because I've been letting everything slide. You've got hands, you'll use them. Yes, that's the understanding. Room and board against work, nothing else." "Yes, nothing else," she said again, and she was not saying it to him so much as she was saying it to the room. Joseph nodded once and let it stand. He understood the shape of what she was drawing on the floor between them. He was not going to step across it, and she was not going to move it. He started on the windmill the second morning, when the snow had let up enough to work outside for the length of a stretch. The mechanism at the top had frozen, and something in the gearing had gone. He climbed the tower in the cold with a wrench in his belt and Samuel below him, steadying the base and calling up what he could see from the ground. And by the middle of the afternoon, the vanes had started to move again, first grudging and then steady, and the pump handle in the yard began to work when Cuthbertson came out to try it, and water came up into the trough for the first time in a season. She stood there with her hand on the pump and she watched the water run, and she did not say anything. She went back into the house. But Joseph noticed that at supper that night she set his bowl down in front of him instead of leaving it on the counter for him to come get, and he understood that as much as he was going to be told. The fences took a week. He and Samuel worked them in the mornings when the light was up and the wind was down, and in the afternoons they came in and Joseph did what needed doing to the porch rail and the barn roof and the pantry door that had never closed right. And Samuel sat at the kitchen table with a slate Cuthbertson had produced from somewhere and did his letters under her eye. She had been a schoolteacher once, before she had been a wife. Joseph learned that from the way she corrected the boy's hand on the chalk, not from anything she said. Emma got her feet under her by the end of the first week. She was thin and she tired easy, but she was walking, and by the second week she was following Cuthbertson from room to room in the way small girls will follow a woman who does not chase them off. Cuthbertson did not chase her off. Cuthbertson did not welcome her either. Cuthbertson simply went about her work and let the child be in the room, and after a few days she began to hand the child small things to hold, a spool of thread, a bowl of peas to shell, a wooden spoon to stir something that did not need stirring, and Emma held them with the seriousness of a child who has been given a job. One afternoon in the third week, Joseph came in from the barn stamping snow off his boots and stopped just inside the door. Cuthbertson was at the table. Emma was standing at her elbow. Cuthbertson had the girl's small hand in hers, and she was guiding it around the edge of a piece of dough, showing her how to crimp it, and she was doing it without looking at the child, the way a woman shows a thing she has shown before to someone else, on a hand that is not the hand she is remembering. Emma looked up and saw her father in the doorway and smiled, and it was the first full smile he had seen out of her since Monday of the bank. And Joseph took his hat off and stood with it in his hands, and did not trust his face to do what he wanted it to do. And Cuthbertson glanced up at him once and looked back down at the dough as if nothing was happening at all, and something was happening, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to name it. The town found out because towns find out. Somebody had seen smoke going up out of the bell chimney at hours it had not gone up in years, and somebody else had ridden past on the county road when the road came back in the last week of January, and had seen a man on the barn roof, and a boy handing him shingles. By the end of that week the story was in the store, and by the end of the next, it had grown the shape stories grow when they are handled by too many hands. Abigail Prunn came out on a Sunday afternoon with a basket she had not brought before, and a look on her face she had rehearsed on the way. She got as far as the porch. Cuthbert met her at the door and did not open it the full way, and Abigail said what she had come to say, which was mostly about appearances and about a widow's reputation, and about children being confused by arrangements that were not what they seemed. She said it in the voice women use when they are pretending to bring a warning that is actually a verdict. Cuthbert listened. She listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was not something Abigail had prepared for and which put her off her rhythm toward the end. When Abigail had finished, Cuthbert said, "Is that all?" Abigail said it was. "Then you can take your basket home," Cuthbert said. "I don't need what's in it and I don't need what came with it." She closed the door. Not hard, just closed it. Abigail stood on the porch a moment and then went down the steps and got in her buggy and drove back to town, and by supper the story had a new chapter, and by the next Sunday the preacher had worked a passage into his sermon that everyone in the pews understood was meant for one house on the ridge, though he did not name it. Cuthbert did not go to church that Sunday. She had not gone to church in 6 years. She went about her Sunday the way she went about every day, and at the noon meal she set the table for 4 without making a thing of it, and Joseph sat down across from her, and Samuel and Emma sat on the long side, and Cuthbert bowed her head over the food for the first time in a long time and said a short grace in a voice so low Joseph almost missed it, and then she picked up her spoon and they ate. The second storm came at the beginning of February, and it was worse than the first. It came in fast on a wind out of the north that took the temperature down 30 degrees inside an afternoon, and it caught the preacher's family on the road back from a visit to a cousin 2 townships over. Reverend Unsla and his wife and their 3 children, in a light buggy meant for a Sunday drive, not for the weather that fell on them. They made it as far as the Bell Rise. The horse gave out at the bottom of the hill. The Reverend came up on foot in the dark with his youngest on his back and the rest of them staggering behind him, and he pounded on Cuthbert's door with a fist that had gone past feeling. And when Cuthbert opened it, he tried to speak and could not, and she pulled him through the door by the front of his coat, and Joseph was already coming down the loft ladder, and Samuel was already at the stove building up the fire. Cuthbert went out into the storm herself with a lantern, and brought back the wife and the 2 older children and got the door closed behind them, and then she went to work. She worked without hurry and without a word wasted. She got the wet coats off the children and got them wrapped in every blanket in the house and set them at the fire with their feet in a basin of warm water she had Joseph draw. She got the Reverend's wife into the rocker with a cup of the same willow and honey she had given Emma, and she got the Reverend himself out of his boots and his fingers into a bowl of water that was cool, and then a bowl that was warmer, working the feeling back into them the slow way that does not cost a man his hands. She did all of it without once looking at the Reverend's face, and the Reverend, for his part, did not look at hers either. There was a sermon between them that both of them had heard about, and neither of them was going to bring it into the room. The Unslas stayed 4 days. The storm held them, and then the drifts held them after the storm let up, and Cuthbert fed all 7 of them out of a pantry that had not been laid in for 7 and did not run out, which was a thing Joseph noticed and did not comment on. She put the Reverend and his wife in her own bed and slept in the rocker by the fire. She put the Unsla children in with Samuel and Emma in the back room, and the 5 of them lay crossways on the bed like cordwood and slept the sleep of children who had been frightened and were not frightened any more. On the second morning the Reverend came out to the kitchen where Cuthbert was at the stove, and he stood behind her a long moment before he spoke. He said, "Mrs. Bell." She did not turn. He said, "I owe you a word." She said, still without turning, "You don't owe me anything, Reverend. You owe your children a quieter road home when the thaw comes. That's all that's owed here." He stood there another moment. Then he said, I spoke out of turn from the pulpit. I want you to know I know it. She turned then. She looked at him with the same plain look she had given Joseph at the door on the first day, and she said, I know you know it. That's enough for me. Sit down and eat your breakfast. He sat down and ate his breakfast. And when the road opened on the fourth day, and the Unslas went home in a wagon Joseph had helped the Reverend dig out, the story that traveled back to town with them was a different story than the one that had traveled up the ridge in Abigail Prun's basket. And it traveled faster, because a story told by a preacher travels faster than a story told by a woman with a grievance. And by the following Sunday the sermon had a different shape to it. And by the Sunday after that the shape had settled. And by the end of the month there were 3 baskets on Catherine's porch on a Monday morning, and none of them had a warning in them. She brought them inside without a word and set them on the counter and unpacked them and put the contents away. And Joseph, coming in from splitting wood, saw the empty baskets stacked by the door and did not say anything, and Catherine, at the counter with her back to him, said, The town's decided to be sorry, that's their business. I'll take what's in the baskets and I'll send the baskets back clean. That's mine. Joseph nodded to her back. He hung his coat on the peg. And that would have been the whole shape of it if the quilt had not needed mending. Emma had carried the quilt out of the old farm the day the bank came, wadded up under one arm because she had refused to leave without it. It had been on her bed since she was a baby. It was a rag quilt, pieced out of scraps that had gone soft with washing, and it had a border of small blue 8-point stars around the edge, and it had come apart along one seam during the ride in Joseph's arms up the ridge, and Emma had asked in the 4th week if it could be mended, and Cuthbert had said, Bring it here. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The light through the kitchen window was the pale, flat light of February that does not warm anything but shows everything clean. Cuthbert sat in the rocker with the quilt spread across her lap and her sewing basket open at her feet, and she was working the torn seam back together with a needle she had threaded without looking. Emma was on the rug in front of the fire with her doll. Samuel was at the table with his slate. Joseph was at the workbench along the back wall, planning down a board for a shelf Cuthbert wanted put up in the pantry. Cuthbert's hand stopped. She had turned the quilt over to work the seam from the back, and her hand had stopped, and she was looking at the underside of one of the star blocks. She was looking at the stitching on the back of it, the small, tight running stitch that held the block together, and she was looking at the corner where the piecer had signed the work with 3 initials in cross-stitch, so small a person would only find them if they knew to look. Joseph, at the bench, heard the planer stop and did not know he had heard it because it had been his own hand that stopped it. Something in the room had gone still. He turned. Cuthbert's face had gone the color of the light through the window. She was holding the quilt up close to her eyes, and she was looking at the corner of the block, and her mouth had come open a small distance, and no sound was coming out of it. Her other hand had come up to her collar and had closed on the fabric there and was holding it. Cuthbert, Joseph said. She did not answer him. She turned the quilt in her lap. She found another block and turned that one over and looked at the back corner of it, and then another, and she was moving faster now, and her breath had gone shallow, and Emma had looked up from her doll and was watching her, and Samuel had set the chalk down. Cuthbert, Joseph said again. Where did she get this? Cuthbert said. Her voice did not sound like her voice. It sounded like a voice coming up from somewhere under her voice. Where did your wife get this quilt, Joseph? He came across the room slowly. He knelt on the floor beside the rocker so that his eyes were level with hers. It was hers when I met her, he said. She had it from before. She said her mother made it for her. She said it was the only thing she brought out when she left. When she left where? She never said. She never would say. She said her people were gone to her and she was gone to them and there was no use going back over the ground. He watched her face. Cuthbert. What is it? Cuthbert put her hand flat on the star block. She spread her fingers over the initials in the corner. She closed her eyes. KMB, she said. Cuthbert Mugret Bell. I stitched those into every block. I was 17 years old. She opened her eyes and looked at him. That quilt was mine, she said. I made it for my baby sister. Joseph did not speak for a long moment. He was looking at her face, and he was doing the arithmetic a man does when a piece of ground he thought he was standing on turns into different ground under his boots. His wife's name had been Ellen. Ellen had run at 15 from a house she would not name in a county she would not name, and she had made her way west, and she had worked in a hotel kitchen where he had found her at 18, and she had married him at 19, and she had died at 29 bringing Emma into the world, and in 11 years she had told him almost nothing about where she had come from, only that she had a sister who had been more mother to her than the mother, and that the sister had married a man named Bell. Ellen, he said. Her name was Ellen. Cuthbert's hand tightened on the quilt. Ullana, she said. She was Ullana. She was 7 years younger than me. She was 13 when our mother died and 15 when she ran. My husband hunted for her for 2 years and never found a trace. We stopped speaking her name in the house because speaking it hurt more than not speaking it. And then my husband died and my son died and I stopped speaking altogether and I told myself I had no people left in the world and I locked the door and I meant it. She looked past him at the 2 children in the room. Emma on the rug with her doll held forgotten in her lap, watching. Samuel at the table standing now, his hand flat on the wood. "Come here," Cuthbert said. She said it to both of them. Her voice had come back into her voice. They came. Emma first, because Emma was 6 and did not hesitate about a woman she had already decided on, and Samuel a step behind because Samuel was 9 and had to work out the shape of a thing before he moved. Cuthbert set the quilt aside and she took Emma's hand in one of hers and Samuel's hand in the other, and she looked at their faces the way a person looks at faces she is seeing for the first time and has been seeing all along. "Your mother was my sister," she said. "You're my blood. You have been since you walked up the road." Samuel's face did the thing a 9-year-old's face does when a large thing is put into it and there is no room prepared. He looked at his father. Joseph nodded once. The boy looked back at Cuthbert and his chin came down and his shoulders came down and he leaned in the small distance that was left, and Cuthbert put her arm around him, and Emma had climbed into her lap without asking, and Cuthbert held them both, and she was not crying, but her breathing had changed. And Joseph got up quietly and went to the bookshelf by the front window. The family Bible was on the top shelf where it had been for 6 years. He took it down and brought it to her and set it in her lap under the children. She looked at it a long moment. Then she opened it to the page she had sworn she would never open again, and she took the pen from the shelf beside her and she wrote 2 names under the last name on the page in a hand that was steady because she had made it steady. Samuel Huvison, Emma Huvison. Then after a pause, a 3rd line, Ullana Bell Huvison, beloved sister, come home. She closed the book. She kept her hands on the cover a moment. Then she looked up at Joseph, and the door she had kept closed for 6 winters was standing open behind her eyes, and she did not close it again. Outside, the wind came off the ridge, clean and cold, and the valley below the house went about its evening, not knowing yet, but it would. See you guys in the next story. Peace.